Thank you very much, Paul. Is this a pointer?
It does, yes.
Right, okay, thanks. I thought today that I would try to bring together a number of the ideas that were generated by Chris Taylor and David Hall and meld them with the work that Mark and the FEATSAX project are doing to try to better understand the development of settlement during settlement and land allocation during the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. So that's the idea. Whether I succeed, of course, is a different matter, but I will give it a shot. And we start with an illustration from one of David Hall's publications, the Atlas of Rockingham Forest. And this is a map which shows townships. Townships are the territories, or rather the township is the community, but what is shown on here are the boundaries of the territories of individual farming communities, and they're in black. And then we have laid on top of them the red lines of the 100 divisions. These are the regional units which encapsulated a number of different townships. And I'll be talking initially about these sorts of units. If I can move to the next slide, which where's Dale? Is it this one?
Yes.
Oh, right, okay, right. This is Helen Kemp's description of townships in a publication of 1950. And she says, the township was an entity both older and longer lived than the lordship. And in this particular case, she's talking about the type of lordship we know as the manor, which is clear from the rest of the sentence. An indispensable unit in the governmental system, and also in many parts of the country, a community conscious and active in its own right. And I want to try to look a bit at the origins of townships, because I think this links very closely with the development of low input, extensive open fields during the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries. And in the 10th century, we have some descriptions of townships in the law codes. This is the law code for Edgar, which dates to somewhere between 966 and 975. And it talks about the responsibilities of the township as a community in investigating any unexpected purchase of livestock, people rustling cattle. And so there's a duty on the part of someone who's from that community, bringing back cattle into the community to be able to demonstrate that they were purchased rather than filched. And the community itself has to make a judgment and report to the ealdorman of the 100, which is the next level in the governance. So they have a place in governance, in communal regulation. They're at the base of the Anglo-Saxon state. And they are people with status. These are not servile peasants. These are ceorls. They are free peasants who were so widespread in the Anglo-Saxon period, not so much later on. And they have rights to investigate livestock if they think there's something fishy been going on in the territories of the King's Thanes, and also in the territories run for the king by reeves. And this law code is really specifically relating to Yorkshire. It's directed to Earl Oslac to implement. So a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about is basically Yorkshire, sort of slightly beyond the spread of samples in the FEATSAX project, or most of them anyway. But the system of townships and hundreds mentioned in this law code There's no sign that these are new creations. It's a system that's been going on for decades, centuries. It's difficult to know when it might have started, but they're there, and they are the mechanisms which Edgar, who is trying to gain greater control particularly of Danish settlements in Northumbria, they're the mechanism through which he exercises that control. So we see them as existing and perhaps long-lived institutions already. Does it go back? One of the problems, though, about those I see. One of the problems, though, about these records is the translations, because the historians who've translated these law codes and other documents, they're very loose with the terms for settlements. So the originals talk about toonsmen and toons. They're about townships, but the translations always say villages. And that's fine for the historians if they think they know what they're talking about, but for archaeologists it's a nightmare, because archaeologists see villages as a specific sort of rural settlement, and there are other sorts of rural settlement. And if we didn't, we would never have changed the name of this group from the Medieval Village Research Group to the Medieval Settlement Research Group. And so I think the problem for the township is it falls in the cracks between various disciplines, and people are not really fully translating the term from one to another. And there's another issue, which is in place names. I'll use this as an example. I can't think of a better example, but this is not a place that was recorded in Domesday. It's first recorded in the 12th century. It's a place called Idle, which is near Bradford. And Idle is a great place. It's spawned a number of really interesting institutions, such as the Idle cricket team. And there is the Idle Working Men's Club, which was founded by sewage workers for, I can tell you later why. But anyway, it still functions under that name. And Idle was a problem for place name scholars, for Smith and others. And the description on the left-hand side of the slide is the oops, it's not going too well, is it? Is the description on the English Place Name Society website, hosted by the University of Nottingham. And they recognise that Idle should be the name for a slow-moving meandering river, and that is how it's recorded in other counties. But it's not here, because the village of Idle is the green shaded bit on this is a plan of 1817, a county plan. The green shaded bit at the centre is the village, and as the website tells us, there is no slow-moving meandering river stream anywhere near that site. But if you actually stand back a few paces and you look at the whole township, the township boundary is the green line shown on this map. And you'll see that half nearly of the township boundary runs on the south side, just on the south side of the River Aire, which here takes this wandering meander loop to go round this ridge. And so the township name does mean, the name Idle does mean a slow-moving meandering river. It's just that it doesn't apply specifically to the place where the village is known to have been in post-medieval times. It applies to the whole township. There are obviously difficulties there, because if we take the Tuna name in township, it starts off as meaning, I understand from the philologists, it means fence, and then by extension it means enclosure, and then by extension from that it means settlement. But it doesn't seem to get any recognition as something wider than settlement that we think of as a habitation site, but it is actually applied to townships. And we see it here, I think. This is a document that was created during the course of the Domesday inquiry. It's called the Yorkshire Summary. And this lists places by 100, but by wapentake or 100. The wapentake is the Danelaw equivalent of the 100 in Yorkshire. And we have here lots of names, some tune names, some names ending in by, which are the Old Norse names, the Bu names, and then some names ending in Thor. But attached to each of these names is an amount of land, a number of carucets or ploughlands. And these are the assessed lands of the townships. We're not talking about habitation sites, we're talking about townships. And the assessment is used for taxation purposes, for dues and obligations and that kind of thing. And that is the basic record, and it's obviously taken from other records. It was just put into the Domesday inquiry as a checklist against estate records. And there are, so the right-hand side of the slide is the wapentake of Manshow, which is up in the Vale of Pickering in Yorkshire. And there are 52 places mentioned in this document in Manshow. And of those 52 places, 85% of them were still townships in the mid-19th century. And I would argue, and I'm sure there are other arguments against this, but I would argue that these are being recorded as townships in the Yorkshire Summary in Domesday, and they then survived as organisational entities, as communities, right down to the mid-19th century. It ties in this with one of the contributions to the book Sense of Place that was published, I think, a decade ago, where Alarik Hall looked at the stability of place names, whether they lasted or didn't last. And he found that the place names of the, sorry, yes, I can't see that either. The place names from the Middle Saxon period are far less likely to have lasted down to the present day than place names of the 10th and 11th centuries. And why is that? I think it's because these names became attached to units of governance, of administration, of public justice, and so therefore it became difficult to change them. Particularly the taxation ones, you need to know from one year to the next, don't you, which place you're talking about. And so I think it's this change to township names that creates this stability in place names. It's not just that they're more recent than the ones around 700 or 800. It's because they're used in a different way. So the township then is the community that's created. It's the basic community of in the countryside. The Feetsax project talks about not a single point of revolution, as Mark said, but a growing series of changes which are easily detectable in terms of cultivation. But you'd have to think then, well, what impact did that have on society? Did people just carry on living where they were living and expanding arable, or was something else happening? And I think there is something else happening. It is the creation of new townships. And the example I used in the last Warren volume, I think is still one of the best ones, and it's this one. And it's an area called Wintringham. And on the left, it's a large folk territory. The northern boundary is the River Derwent, and next to the River Derwent there are marshland pastures. It runs southwards up through the agricultural land, the cultivation grounds, and then at the very southern end it runs up onto the Yorkshire Wolds. This is again the Vale of Pickering, and it provides the dry sheep pastures and so on. So it's got a good range of everything you need as a farming community. And it is the folk territory of the people called the Wintringers. And this is all hypothetical, of course. I've got no proof that this is how it happened, but it just makes sense. And I always go with things that make sense. So at some point, or at various points, that big territory was divided up into smaller townships. And you have 3 Toon townships established. On the left, you have Rillington, which is an Old English personal name, and Toon. Scampston is an Old Norse personal name and Toon, and Knapton means the township of the youths or the children or the servants. And I think it's quite an interesting name because one wonders whether that's part of the process of generating new townships by giving lands to younger generations who will not normally take over the farm shares of the existing township. But you also see that when these new units are being generated, they leave Wintringham with a long strip of ground through the centre right down to the River Derwent, so that they're not depriving. So it's all these, both Wintringham and the new townships have the same full range of resources that Wintringham itself did in the early times, just smaller amounts. But it strikes me that this might be part of that low input extensification of arable farming. And then the final part of this process is the creation of a thorp, which from the work of Richard and others we know was a very frequently used generic name in the later 10th, 11th centuries. There is a thorp established, and that thorp is established on the outgang of Rillington. So this is the area where the cattle were taken through the open fields or the sheep and up onto the pastures of the wolds. And so it would be where those animals were collected for taking back to move to other pastures. So I think it would create enhanced fertility on the soil, and perhaps this is why that thorp was created. But by putting it there, it took away Rillington and Scampston's bits of the Yorkshire Wold. So what happened was that there's a chunk here of land which right the way down to 1850 was a detached portion of Scampston and Rillington. So they were given a detached portion in compensation for the territory they'd already lost. The whole process of township formation, I think, was very largely, certainly in this part of Yorkshire, was very largely spent by the time of the Norman Conquest, which is why so many of the 19th century townships appear, if that's what the records show, in the Yorkshire Summary. But of course, that's not the end of township creation. There was another great spate in the 19th century, including this one. This is a survey of one of them. And this occurred after the Civil War, not our Civil War, but the American Civil War. And when the Midwest was opened up in the 1860s, late 1860s onwards, they surveyed large chunks of ground, which they then broke up into townships. So this is part, there are 4 farms on the left-hand side of this slide. They're part of a township known as Township 20, Range 13, west of the 6th principal meridian, which I suppose doesn't give place name scholars much to go on, but this is a survey township. This is before anyone buys anything. And so they're laid out in that fashion. And then as people occupy these townships, they then become civil townships. And there are about 20 of them in this area, which is the county of Barton. Barton, I should add to this audience, is named after the woman who founded the American Red Cross. It's not a more interesting Barton. And on the right-hand side, you see one of those farms. And the acres, the stripes, the strips of arable shown on there, it says there are 10 of each square furlong, one normal common field acre, 40 poles by 4 or 220 yards by 22. So although they're not creating open field systems and village settlements, there's still this mindset. And it's quite interesting to see a township or townships which are not encumbered by manorial institutions which clamped themselves on the English townships from very early years during their creation. So that's the township bit. If I've had half my time, yes. So the second part is about what happens in those townships and how they're created. Again, this goes back to David Hall's work, and this is the township of Maxey, north of Peterborough, where, along with many other townships, he recognised that there were long, curving strips of ground, these things here, that he's marked out, that is emphasised in the field systems, which seem to show, as he says, that there were extensive blocks of curved strips that were marked out in a single operation. And what happens thereafter is that they're broken up into smaller furlongs, perhaps, several times. But they are the basic structure. And I think these long curved strips are how you lay out the land in a township, and they become the shares, the share lands of that township. And farming families have a particular share. I almost sometimes fantasize about it being a sort of joint stock company, where people have shares in an enterprise, and it's part of, I think it's part of what Ross Faith, in that terrific book, The Moral Economy of the Countryside, is called the moral economy. It's part of that. It's something that everyone understands and knows and abides by. It doesn't mean to say that everyone has an equal share, but it's a proportionate thing, and it is founded on the assessed land, which goes back to the carucates, the ploughlands that I talked about earlier. But it is these long curving strips that are the original shares, and you add to them all the other resources within that particular township. So each farmer has an aliquot share of the whole township, all the resources based on the assessed land that farmer has. These are most of David Hall's examples in and around Northamptonshire. Those sort of field systems were broken up during the Middle Ages into the sort of patchwork of furlongs that you're used to seeing in maps of open fields. But there are some places where that did not occur, and one of them is here, again in the Vale of Pickering, to the west of Pickering itself, which was a big royal estate centre. And there are a number of townships, and even as late as 1850, when this map was created, you can see these long curving lands running and right the way through these townships, and also through, in some cases, through the enclosures within the village settlement. They seem to precede the village settlements. They, of course, have gone, but you see the same thing these days in parts of Poland. This is an area of Poland which is about 20 kilometers west of Krakow, so it's in southern Poland. And I spent an hour or two on a very cold December afternoon standing by the road watching one of these strips being ploughed. And it was being ploughed by a very elderly couple, or at least they seemed that way, but it might have been the hard life. And they were using a Moldbort plough, an iron Moldbort plough, pulled by a horse that looked just as elderly as they were. And it was fascinating to watch that. I didn't take any photographs because they seemed very intrusive, given that it was serious business for them. But they kind of need to nudge the horse occasionally just to keep it running down the furrow, and they're coming down down the strip towards me. But then when they got just below the road, the strip ended, and they had to shift the horse and the plough over to the other side of the strip to plough the equivalent furrow up that side. And it took them forever. And yes, I mean, they were elderly, but it just struck me that sort of changing direction with that sort of ploughing requires an enormous amount of effort. And you've got to think about the effort of cultivation as against the energy created by that cultivation. You know, there's a balance there somewhere. And of course, it takes time. And so some of these strips in England run for up to 2.5 kilometres. And they just cross roads, they cross streams, they just keep going. And I think it's because if you have too many breaks and you have to start ploughing in the other direction, you're just taking up far too much time to be able to do the job at all. The other thing I noticed about this particular area was that the settlements, I mean, you can call them villages, but they're really a series of farmsteads strung out. And of course, these are modern farmsteads. I don't know what it was like in the Middle Ages, but they're strung out along these strips, and they seem to be related more organically to the strips, if I can put it that way, than some of the village settlements, say like Middleton on the previous slide, which are sort of plonked onto the strips. And so I think this is perhaps telling us something about the settlement associated with these. And these strips are shares, dale, or the Old Norse dale, both meaning a share or a portion. And it was just generally accepted that you had a share. You might have a big share, you might have a small share, but it was land that was shared out. And you kind of see something hinted at in the laws of Ine, which are sort of late 7th or 8th century, but the surviving text is from Alfred's time, much later. If Churl have a common meadow or other land divided in shares to fence, and some have fenced their portion, dal, and some have not, and then it's a law about what happens when someone else's cattle eat your crops and so on. And it doesn't tell us anything about how this land was farmed. I mean, I'm not talking here about common field farming systems. I'm just talking about shares. And the shares are almost severalty shares. They're run by a single farming family. There's how cooperation works is a different matter, and we simply don't have the evidence except for Mark's work and the work of the Feetsats team. But it does suggest that some land can be common and some land can be divided up by particular shareholders, already long before the Scandinavian settlement. And there are other documents from this period, certainly from the 10th century, which seem to relate in some way to shares. I haven't really thought this through yet, but I'll keep trying. So we have lands belonging to, or lands granted to Archbishop Oscytel, the Archbishop of York, in the 10th century. Manslots, which are generally by some scholars thought to be allotments of land to Danish settlers, to members of the Danish army, if you want to put it that way. And you get references to every 6th acre, every 5th acre, and so on, and every 3rd acre. And you get references to shares, dales. And you see this sort of thing happening in somewhere like Preston, which is again Yorkshire and Holderness, where you have a serious number of units called bydales, dale against share, and people's shares are laid out in basically 2 fields, one north and one south of the settlement, which is marked by this rather murky line down the centre here. This is the settlement, and it's a very long settlement. And if you look in detail at it, or parts of it, it's got an east end and a west end. So it's a bit like a polyfocal settlement of Christalas, but it's also got this village settlement here. And I think it would probably be natural enough to assume that the village settlement came first and then settlements somehow spread out along this line. But I think it's the opposite. And the reason a village settlement is created here is because there are bondmen of Brustwick or Burstwick. Burstwick is the next township along, and it's the capital, the centre of the Lordship of Holderness. And I think tenants are being moved out from it into Preston. And so I suspect that this nucleated village settlement here is the bondmen who belong to Burstwick. And the farms spread outside are the numerous freeholders, and there are 65 freehold ox gangs here. So the half the population is still freeholders in, well, the record's 1750. We don't hear anything about the freeholders during the Middle Ages because the records haven't survived. But I think that they are probably some of these free farmers, free peasants who are establish Preston in maybe the 8th or 9th centuries. And we see similar structures here with these very long settlement enclosures, and there are some in North Lincolnshire. Rex Russell mapped some North and South Killingham. There's some on the Yorkshire Wolds. All I'm saying is that I think these are structures that are worth bearing in mind and deserving of further investigation. The slide here is one I've published, or it's information I've published about the insertion of two Scandinavian communities, Roxby and Farmanby, into a large previously organised community called Thornton. And this is where those shares at the every 5th and every 6 acre stuff come in, because it's a very flexible system for re-sharing out land. You know, if you're going to divide a township into two, you need to give new shares to each new community. And you can do that. And if you're going to insert Scandinavian settlements, Scandinavian communities into a pre-existing landscape full of English communities, then that also works. And I think the slide on the left actually shows the creation of two new communities. If you want the details, you have to look at the publication, which are on the basis of, let's say, the area of the township to the west of Thornton Beck, because it's only part of the township lands. Every 2nd acre goes to Roxby and every 3rd acre goes to Farmanby. And you end up, for various reasons, with this really unusual pattern of interlocking different bits of township in that area. I think that's how it occurs. I'll say finally a few words about this interesting place, which has both an Old Norse name and an Old English name. Brafferton means the broad ford. That's the Old English name. It was a rural manor. Helperby, Helps community, Helpsby, was inserted into that in probably the late 9th century. And it took part of Brafferton, but it also took some land from the next township southwards called Mitton. And it took two dales from Mitton. So we're back to that sort of sharing. And as I say, it's a flexible system for being able to grow the number of townships and introduce new communities into areas already well settled. And the great thing about that particular village is this is where you come in from the east, from Raskelf, into the village centre. You see what looks like, you know, a street village, rows of houses on either side. It's a village. Well, it isn't a village, because the houses on the right-hand side are in Brafferton and the houses on the left-hand side are in Helperby. And North Yorkshire County Council Highways Department very kindly marked the township boundary out with that white dashed line. So finally, a minute or so, I've spent, yes, more decades than I can remember, talking about when did villages start, when did open fields start. It's I think they're stupid questions, frankly, at this stage, because it implies that there was a period when there were no villages, and then suddenly there were villages, and there were no open fields, and suddenly there were open fields. And it's a kind of binary answer, isn't it? You know, they're either there or not there. And I think particularly the work that Mark and the FeedStack people are doing is showing that it isn't that simple. I mean, if you think of you talk, you know, in brackets, the agricultural revolution, talk about the industrial revolution. The steam engines operating in 1790 were nothing like the steam engines operating in 1920. And so there is bound to be, in any revolution, it's a gradual accumulation. It's not just something that's plunked, in this case, into the landscape, or in that case, into, you know, the areas of industry. It develops gradually through time, and I think you need both the archaeobotanical component, which is what FeedStack is doing, but I think also you have to think about how such a big change over maybe 2 or 3 centuries is impacting on society, and I think that's where townships and sharelands come in. Thank you.